Hi folks, this is Tacitus Today at your Pushback channel. The subject for this op-ed essay is understanding the realities and key details of fascism, Nazism and communism. This will be an essay for students, novice political watchers and activists generally. If you'd like to avoid the preamble and cut to the chase, go to 340 now. Whether it is the political left or the spruikers of globalisation generally, it seems anyone who questions or deviates even slightly from the approved narrative of, say, mass immigration is accused of being a fascist, a Nazi, or even a personification of Hitler himself. Incredibly, the Greek-Jewish homosexual in a mixed-race relationship commentator Milo Yiannopoulos is fancifully condemned as a Nazi simply for disagreeing with some of the prevailing leftist dogma. Calling someone a Nazi is such a first resort put-down and a way of silencing those with alternative views that it is often the denunciation weapon of choice for those who cannot prevail in a contest of ideas and who cannot present coherent arguments. Nor is it a reflection of formidable intellectual capacity or curiosity to perpetually reach for the Hitler tag just to shut up everyone else. Yet to utter the word Hitler or Nazi bestows on the SJW utterer a halo of misguided virtue and righteousness. Maybe this Hitler and Nazi name-calling has been a bit overdone. At least understand what you're talking about. Yet ask just about anyone who throws a Nazi or Hitler tag around with careless abandon. Ask them about Hitler or who was Hitler and who were the Nazis, definition of fascism, the history and times of post-World War I Europe, and nobody knows. Ask if they know or have heard of the greatest mass murderers in history, such as Stalin, Mao and Pol Pot, and all you get is a blank, uncomprehending stare in return. The propaganda of, say, Antifa and other groups allegedly opposed to fascism focuses particularly on one issue, and this is very telling. They are against whites being majority in a majority white country. They don't seem to be against Asians being majority in Asian countries or blacks being majority in black countries, so what is this thing with whites? Whites who believe it's okay to be a white are fascist Nazis. So whites are the only people not allowed to be a racial majority anywhere in the world, not even in their own countries. By such logic, why are not black or Asian majority countries not also fascist? Why is BLM not protesting and demonstrating in Beijing or Islamabad? Why are the political left not advocating for special white gay lesbian suburbs with specialist pork restaurants in Karachi or Kabul? Why not spread some of this Western diversity and tolerance around so everyone can benefit? This so-called anti-fascism has nothing to do with opposing fascism, or rather the straw fascism that they invent, and everything to do with promoting open borders and mass third world migration to the West. The whole idea of fascism may be just an invention to be used as cover and to maybe justify activism against those who do not agree with globalisation. So let's look at who the Nazis and fascists were and how they came to be, and contrast this with communism, while making mention of Western libertarianism as we explore some of the issues. If you have a choice, like me, you're going to pick a democratic, libertarian society to live in. But let's look at this fascism and communism and Nazism and see how we go. The aftermath of World War I had caused massive upheaval in Europe. Many areas were devastated. Tens of thousands of kilometres of national boundaries were substantially redrawn. Ethnic minorities were expelled from new nation states, causing a permanently floating population of almost 6 million citizens, many of which were Jews. In the general chaos, large numbers of stateless drifters moved into Germany and Austria, standing in line at soup kitchens, raising the ire of the hard-pressed local population. Many more millions handicapped from war injuries begged pitifully in the streets all across Europe. 3 aristocratic empires were swept away by the war, and other remaining monarchies very wisely became more constitutional in nature. It had been more than 100 years since Europe had seen upheaval and anything remotely approaching that scale of devastation and moving and redrawing national boundaries. Like any game-changing upheaval, it unleashes forces that are peculiar to the times, the geography and the local circumstances, and this is critical in understanding communism, fascism and Nazism. Following the 1917 Bolshevik or Communist Marxist Revolution in Russia, political working-class armed revolution was feared and anticipated across much of Europe, with many political observers and revolutionaries alike believing that our bankrupt and enfeebled near-leaderless German state was ripe for such revolution. The German Kaiser had abdicated and fled to neutral Holland. After the loss of the war, much of the German political leadership was in turmoil. For many Europeans, just trying to find food was the all-consuming task of those times. At the end of 1918 and into January 1919, the so-called Spartacist uprising or revolution, led by long-time Marxist activist Karl Liebknecht and lesbian communist feminist Rosa Luxemburg, attempted to take over the government of Germany from the capital Berlin. The revolution was defeated, and both Liebknecht and Luxemburg were arrested and later died under highly suspicious circumstances. To this day, in former Soviet East Germany, they are revered as icons, particularly Rosa Luxemburg by the far left. Subsequent communist revolutions broke out across Germany during 1919, the most prominent being in Munich, where communists and local authorities backed by units of the army had running street battles over several days, resulting in more than 500 deaths. Undeterred, communist gangs roamed the streets of all German cities starting in 1919 and 1920, intimidating voters, extorting money from shopkeepers, beating up citizens, beating up police officers and public officials, intimidating magistrates, invading school classrooms, insisting Marxist class struggle was taught. Not surprisingly, most Germans were concerned the country would collapse into revolution or even anarchy if the communist street thuggery continued, and so a street-level political movement was formed to counter it. The name of the street-level political party formed to combat the communists was, or rather later became, the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. Note the socialist in the name. In German, the abbreviation or shorthand, it became known as the Nazi Party. While still permitting ownership of private property and private industry, the National Socialists were what we would see today as socialist in many respects. The Nazis failed to qualify as revolutionaries, as they firmly believed political power, initially at least, must come from the ballot box, and many, although not all of the existing public institutions, would remain largely unchanged. The eternal anti-fascist, anti-communist fight to the death narrative began here, as from the outset both Nazis and communists were committed to the destruction of each other. Yet in some core ideologies at least, they were very similar in a number of respects. Much but not all of the essential difference between socialists and communists is the means to gain power. Communists, and read here impatient radical socialists, favour armed revolution. Nazis and socialists prefer to gain political power through the existing state structures and win, to some extent at least, the popular vote. Socialists have only democratically gained power over the last 100 years in 3 election outcomes that are today hotly disputed in terms of their legitimacy in South America, including Guyana, Chile and Venezuela. While Mussolini and Hitler were both appointed to government, the Nazis at least were the largest party in the German parliament and technically met the requirements for a 53% voter majority when in coalition with another smaller party. All other socialist communist governments were formed following violent revolution. In terms of total deaths caused, Hitler and the Nazis rank 4th behind Chairman Mao in China, Comrade Stalin in the Soviet Union or Soviet Russia, and the Genghis Khan and the Mongol hordes. Yet in the early 1920s, a time of turmoil was to begin where communists and Nazis continually battled each other in the streets of Germany with any makeshift weapons they could lay their hands on. The scale of the unrest and the uncertainty it fostered seems somewhat inconceivable today. These communist versus Nazi street battles could ebb and flow not only through the downtown areas of many German cities, but spill into the suburbs and various public places such as public parks, shopping areas, election booths, sports field, main roads, intersections and so on. The Nazi appeal to many people was that they were opposed to the communists and their thug street gangs, and importantly promised to restore order so people could go about their business unmolested. The Nazis, however, were far from a sure thing. Hitler was a lower middle class guy and spoke with a disguised Austrian accent. National politics in Germany was the domain of the upper classes, who spoke with a crisp Prussian accent. Hitler was an unlikely political party leader at the time. By the late 1920s, the Nazi Party was the biggest political party in Germany, yet the ruling classes still viewed Hitler as lower class, plebeian, vulgar and uncultured, a useful tool to control the working classes and keep them away from communism, but little else. After having begun to economically recover after the war, it was the Great Depression of 1929 that caused a large rise in unemployment and hardship that emboldened the communists to see their time for revolution in Germany had arrived, and they ramped up the street thuggery. A frightened German body politic turned very reluctantly to the largest political party in the parliament, or the Reichstag, the Nazi Party, and appointed its uncouth and non-aristocratic leader, Adolf Hitler, as Chancellor or Prime Minister in January 1933, if only to maintain public order. Although in coalition with a much smaller party led by the distinctly aristocratic Franz von Papen, the Nazi Party held only 2 of the 11 senior ministries. Once order was restored, Hitler could be quietly got rid of, or so it was thought by some. The definition of fascist or fascism has changed over the years and contains the obvious and negative association with Nazism, the Second World War and the later ethnic mass murder. Fascism, or its place in the modern lexicon, has been largely defined by hard-left socialists and communists, who see it first and foremost as anti-communist and anti-the myth of a socialist paradise of equality. Nazism, as mentioned above, is in fact quite largely socialist and in favour of racial homogeneity of the already incumbent race and bringing the populace together through the common national purpose. It might be halfway, say, between 1930s British libertarianism and Soviet communist authoritarianism, and Nazis accepted most forms of private ownership and private profit. While fascism used far fewer coercive measures and allowed many more liberties than communism, it nonetheless generally does not support a free press and is minimally democratic, preferring to run occasional plebiscites to gain public support and approval. Nazis, for example, were far less likely to arbitrarily jail people for political thought crimes, while communist regimes deemed wrongthink as among the most serious crimes imaginable. Where communism often brutally enforces conformity of private thought with a large state spy machine, arbitrary arrests and arbitrary detention, fascism had a higher level of tolerance of the individual in this area, or at least was less inclined to criminalise private views. Fascists, for example, still permitted religious worship and Christian religious worship, where communists rarely did. Both communism and fascism victimised certain minorities. The communists targeted class enemies for thought crimes or imagined thought crimes, or thought crimes that may be committed in the future, using the handy catch-all of class enemies or enemies of the people and so on. Even today, the putting to death of tens of millions of people by the communists is considered acceptable in some quarters, provided the class enemy wrongthink mantra is invoked, and the enemy in communist terms was typically the middle class. The Nazis, on the other hand, were less concerned with thought crimes and instead focused on racial and other issues. Jews, gypsies and homosexuals did not fare well under Nazism. However, Jews did not do so well in tolerant communist Russia either. Orthodox Jews, and particularly Jews writing and conversing in Yiddish, were frequently subject to arbitrary arrest and imprisonment, and even execution on largely invented crimes. Part of this was the Russian or the Soviet view that Yiddish, being close to old or medieval German or Hochdeutsch, that it represented a Germanic strain. But this wasn't the case. It was because they were Jews. Cosmopolitan Jews were somewhat tolerated, but even they too were killed off if they became or were seen as overly influential. One of the great Jewish communist political intellectuals of the 20th century, Leon Trotsky or Bronstein, was later murdered by the Soviet regime of Joseph Stalin. Oddly today, the far left, in their condemnation of fascism, focuses on Nazi tolerance of Christian religion, the idea the majority white country should be majority white, the pro-middle class nature of Nazism, and the continuation of private profit and private ownership. And the rough time meted out to homosexuals and lesbians particularly drives the modern left apoplexy. Wouldn't the concentration camps be a far more fertile ground to attack Nazism on? And what of the communist Russian and Chinese mass murder of its own citizens? That hardly seems to get mentioned. That fascism of those times placed an emphasis on nationalism is not necessarily a precondition or requirement of fascism. The concept of social and racial unity is hardly a controversial issue. Italy and Germany had only federated as nation-states quite recently in the 1860s and 1870s respectively. Following disruptions and tumult of World War I, it was reasonably feared both nations could break apart into smaller nation-states. Thus, any politicians of the day faced with such challenges, and regardless of political affiliation, would have stressed national identity and social cohesion. Whereas the fascists of the day did emphasise shared values, particularly shared values derived from shared history, the communists then and now stress strict conformity of ideological thought and see the past exclusively in the revolutionary terms of guilt and shame. Communists wanted to sweep the past away, whereas the Nazis and Italian fascists were prepared to work with local history and customs, including most, not all, of the existing social structures. Thought crimes in communist societies such as Soviet Russia could and did involve arbitrary arrest, arbitrary detention, torture and re-education, which is a euphemism for more torture, death, or long periods in labour camps where many died from the privations suffered there. Thought crimes were not a fascist staple up until well into World War II. Arrest warrants for more than 95% of the population still required due course and the signature of a magistrate. Moreover, communism stressed internationalist world revolution, and the Soviet communist Russian state sought to subjugate various other peoples within its orbit, such as Asians, Arabs, Poles and Eskimos, Romanians and more, and thus played the multicultural card by necessity in elaborate propaganda pretense that held that all races were unified by ideology and revolutionary ardour rather than race or shared history or shared customs and so on. Export of armed revolution to other countries was part of the Soviet constitution. Fascism had no such intention to spread world revolution and so maintained a pan-Germanic or pan-Italian focus. A personality cult following encouraged by both Hitler and Stalin blurred the lines between socio-political aspects of society and operational management methods of both systems of government. The Soviets behaved as if socialist communism was a perfect system, and so all those who may have believed otherwise or doubted it or were insufficiently fervent were seen as morally bankrupt to the point of criminality or even declared insane. With Nazism, while one's prospects were clearly improved by becoming an ardent Nazi, it was not a requirement or a necessity for day-to-day existence. Moreover, as German industry essentially remained in private hands, management could still decide on who to hire or who to appoint as, say, a senior executive. Hitler even privatised some state-owned enterprises. No such freedoms existed in Soviet Russia or Communist China, where ideological conformity commissars with powers of arbitrary arrest were placed in all state enterprises. The theoretical aspects of fascism were developed by an Italian political thinker, Giovanni Gentile, a well-respected left-leaning academic and author of the Times. Giovanni Gentile not only wrote a number of foundational works for fascism, and even one in conjunction with Mussolini, but also held senior governmental and academic positions in the Italian fascist government. The corporatist model of government envisioned by Gentile and Mussolini, where cooperation between government, industry and workers along with some centralised organisation, but where private property and private profit was still permitted, as was freedom of commercial association, was in many ways a new experience for Italy. Germany is quite different and had a different form of fascism. From the outset, the model for a federated Germany of 1871 demonstrated many of the facets of corporatising. Many of the key inputs associated with striving for and achieving national greatness were part of the German social and political landscape well before Hitler came along or before Nazism or fascism came along. Education, workers' organisations, government support and planning assistance, business and finance were all encouraged to work closely together to achieve common goals. Things such as universal pensions and pathways to advanced education were standard practice from 1870 onwards in Germany and were even expanded by the Nazis. Even during the war, Germany had the most generous welfare system in Europe, if not the world. From an organisational sense at least, fascism or state corporatism was no great leap and not a tough sell for the Nazis or for the Germans to embrace. So for the average German, there was no great policy difference between, say, Chancellor Bismarck of the 1870s and Hitler and his administration. Moreover, the Nazis by and large accepted a merit system where it mattered most. The better qualified inventors, managers, scientists, engineers and designers always did well. Whereas regardless of ability or achievement, wrongthink in communist societies could easily end in execution. Today, the relationship between the definition of fascism and the use of the term in the media or political discourse is tenuous at best. Journalists and members of the commentariat refer to fascists as being politically far-right, whilst in this parlance far-right seems to mean any entity, political party or person that does not agree with the commentariat or those who support, say, forced mass migration against the will of the electorate. The libertarian position, that is, the rights and liberties of the individuals within a civis, was never an out-of-the-box ideology, but rather developed over time. In democratic libertarian societies, the codified law is designed to be supreme, which is not the case in communism, and only tenuously so in certain aspects of, say, Nazism. Modern libertarian democratic society developed gradually over centuries with steps forward and back. It has endured and developed because it is a form of government and social organisation that most effectively reflects the natural or organic structure of human nature, human needs and human relationships, as well as apportioning scarce available resources within a group. It is not perfect, but does place voluntary association as a key component. Communism tends to be a wild swing of the pendulum or a sudden surge, not a gradual or organic development. Marxist or socialist communism demands that people agree and conform under threat. To be coerced in such a way automatically leads to loss of basic legal rights and often loss of economic rights. Fascism leaves many commercial and basic rights unchanged, and at least by its original definition is created uniquely by short-term stimuli and local geopolitical circumstances, namely failure of other forms of government. The libertarian system asks the people as individuals to express their will and participate by choice and share those values of choice and personal responsibility under the law, and generally not by coercion. Some argue true communism was never fully tried, and therefore the failures attributed to it are irrelevant to the political discourse. All previous failed attempts were one-off aberrations, it is often suggested. Such a view is hard to sustain. Any system that relies on that much coercion and suppression to achieve ideological behavioural conformity and presupposes its unquestioned superiority to all other systems of government can never last, quite apart from the economic challenges of central planning. Yet others argue libertarian democracy is a modern phenomenon, say from the 1780s onwards, and can only work when essential conditions unique to wealthy nations experiencing overall trends of economic growth and producing consistent economic surpluses are in place. This is somewhat true, and some of the elements of democracy are all about arbitrating access to and distribution of access to those surpluses. As the rich Western democracies fall into self-inflicted terminal decline, it is argued in some quarters that the rule of law democracy has run its course and has outworn its usefulness and cannot effectively function in societies focusing on redistribution of a declining relative economic pie rather than focusing on new wealth creation. It's a big issue of statecraft debate today. Using the strict definition of totalitarianism, most communist societies fully meet the totalitarian definition, whereas fascism, which allows for private property, private industry and private profit, as well as a degree of personal liberty outside of the main ideological beltway, does not fully meet the totalitarian definition. Communist or socialist societies sometimes do allow for facade-style elections, but only the ruling political party is represented, and often only one candidate per district is standing for office. The outcome is a foregone conclusion. Fascism tends not to bother with elections, instead opting for public approval plebiscites every few years or so. As fascism permits private property, private wealth, and business responding to market signals, it is more committed to achieving higher standards of living and quality of life for the majority of the working class than communism. The fascist government of Germany, Italy and Spain were committed to availability of affordable consumer goods, such as cameras for the masses and motor vehicles, and were better able to do this than the centrally planned and more cumbersome community planning system in the communist nations. Increasingly, as Western governments seek to control media and what citizens think and say, politicise courts and law enforcement, and demonise sections of their own population, they move closer to the definition of totalitarianism and further away from libertarianism. So let's summarise. Fascism is more socialist and right-wing, believing in generous pensions, maternity benefits, worker insurance and invalid benefits. A close and mostly voluntary working relationship between professionals, workers' unions, business owners, government and academia give a superficial appearance of some central planning, but as private profit, freedom to travel and associate commercially and private property were protected, business associations were mostly by choice and for mutual benefit. Communism did not allow freedom of association, and travel outside of one's immediate district required government permission and travel papers. Travelling to another country required special permission and often lengthy interrogation before travel documents were issued, which was rare indeed for anyone other than party insiders. Private property and private profit were not permitted other than the most exceptional circumstances. In some communist societies, as much as half the population is spying on the other half and informing the authorities down to absolute micro details. Paranoia was part of day-to-day living. By contrast, fascist societies, in peacetime at least, employ very few spies, suggesting general community support was more widespread than in communist societies. The Russian-German War of 1941-45 saw a titanic military struggle between these two totalitarian regimes, with the outcome hanging in the balance between September 1941 and December 1942. The Soviet-Russian propaganda depicted the fascists as the opposite of leftist communism, which placed fascism to the right of the political spectrum, and it seems the tag has stuck ever since. This is Tacitus Today, your pushback channel. Thank you for listening. We hope you found this essay informative. All our essays are available in printed book format.